For the last 8 months, I thought I had become invisible in my own home, not the kind of invisible where people forget to say good morning, the kind where they look right through you, where your presence is tolerated the way you tolerate a crack in the wall. You see it every day. You just choose not to deal with it. I was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer who had spent 34 years building bridges across 3 states, and somehow I had let myself be reduced to a ghost in the house I paid for. They had no idea I had already spoken to my attorney. Let me back up. My wife, Diane, passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. We had been married 38 years, and when she died, I didn't just lose a person. I lost the whole architecture of my daily life. The coffee at 6:15, the way she folded the newspaper and left the crossword half finished for me, the sound of her moving around the kitchen, all of it gone. My son, Connor, was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Columbus at the time. He came home for the funeral, stayed 2 weeks, then went back. That was fine. He had his life. I understood. I am not the kind of man who asks his children to sacrifice their lives for his grief. What I didn't understand, what I should have seen coming, was Veronica. Connor met her about 18 months after Diane passed. He brought her to Christmas that first year, and I tried. I genuinely tried. She was polished, charming in the way that certain people are charming when they want something. She laughed at the right moments. She complimented my house. She said, "Connor has told me so much about you," and smiled in a way that never quite reached her eyes. I told myself I was being too protective, that I was still raw from losing Diane and projecting. I told myself a lot of things that year. They got engaged in the spring. Connor called me from Columbus, and he was so happy that I pushed every reservation I had to the back of my mind and told him congratulations and meant it. He was 34 years old. He deserved happiness. Whatever unease I felt about Veronica, I told myself that was mine to manage, not his. The wedding was June the following year. I paid for a significant portion of it because Connor was still building his career as a project manager, and the costs were significant. I didn't say anything about that. I didn't keep score. That's not who I am. 3 months after the wedding, Connor called to tell me they were thinking about buying a house. "That's great," I said. "What are you looking at?" There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Actually, Dad," he said, "we were thinking about your place." My place, my house. The house Diane and I bought in 1999. The house where Connor grew up, where we had Thanksgiving for 20 years, where Diane planted the rose beds along the south fence that I still water every spring because I can't bring myself not to. "We thought it would make sense," Connor said, talking faster now, filling the silence I wasn't offering. "The house is too big for just you. You said that yourself. And it would save us from taking on a massive mortgage, and you'd have family nearby. You want to move into my house," I said. "We'd pay rent," he said quickly, "something fair, and obviously you'd still live there." I should have said no that day. I know that now. But he was my son, and I missed him. And if I am being completely honest with myself, the house had felt very large and very quiet for a very long time. So I said yes. They moved in that September. I gave Connor and Veronica the master suite. It was the largest room. It had the ensuite bathroom. It made sense for a couple. I moved into what had been the guest room, a perfectly comfortable room with a queen bed in its own closet at the end of the hallway. I told myself this was a reasonable arrangement. 2 adults, 1 house, shared costs. Diane would have been practical about it too. The rent lasted 4 months. In January, Veronica told Connor that the rent arrangement felt transactional and was creating emotional distance in the family dynamic. I know this because I heard the conversation through the wall, not intentionally, but the guest room shares a wall with what used to be the dining room, and Veronica's voice carries when she is making her case about something. Connor stopped mentioning the rent. I didn't push. Again, I told myself I was being flexible, being a good father. What I was actually doing was allowing a precedent to be set. By spring, small things were shifting. My workbench in the garage got moved to make room for Veronica's storage boxes. I found my fishing gear stacked against the back wall instead of hanging on the pegboard where it had lived for 20 years. When I mentioned it to Connor, he looked genuinely uncomfortable and said, "Veronica's been reorganizing. She just needed the space, Dad. It's not a big deal." I started to understand that in this new version of my house, I was a guest. The dinner table incident happened in July. We were eating together. Connor, Veronica, and me, which happened maybe 3 times a week. Veronica was talking about wanting to convert the guest room into a nursery. They weren't expecting a baby. She had simply decided she wanted to be emotionally prepared. The guest room, I said slowly, is where I sleep. Veronica smiled. It was the same smile from Christmas 2 years ago, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Right, but there are other options. The den downstairs would work really well as a bedroom. It's actually more private. The den downstairs was unfinished space. Concrete floor. Single small window near the ceiling. We used it for holiday decorations and old tax returns. That's not a bedroom, I said. We could make it into one, Connor said. He was looking at the table. I put my fork down. I looked at my son who I had coached in Little League, who I had driven to every college visit, who I had helped move 4 times in 6 years. I looked at him and waited for him to look up. He didn't. I didn't say anything else that night. I excused myself, said I was tired, and went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed that had been in that guest room since 2003, and I made 2 decisions. The first was that I was not moving to the basement. The second was that I was calling my attorney the next morning. Her name is Barbara Okafor, and she has handled my estate planning since 2008. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about her. When I finished, she said, "Do you know whose name the deed is in?" "Mine," I said. "Then you have options," she said. "Several of them." I want to say here that I did not go to Barbara with revenge in mind. I went because I was 67 years old, and I had spent 8 months slowly being managed out of my own life, and I needed someone clear-headed to tell me what I could actually do. The anger came later. That morning, what I mostly felt was tired. Barbara walked me through everything. The deed was in my name alone. Diane and I had refinanced in 2015, and at that point I took over sole ownership for estate planning reasons. Connor had no legal claim to the property. The verbal rent agreement, which had never been formalized, was effectively a month-to-month tenancy. I had the right to reclaim the property with proper notice. "How long a notice?" I asked. 30 days is the minimum in Ohio, she said. "But I'd recommend 60, given that this is family. Gives everyone time to make arrangements and reduces conflict." I also told her about the retirement account situation. This was the piece I hadn't mentioned to anyone. When Connor and Veronica first moved in, Veronica had raised the idea of investing in the house together. Renovations, she called it. New kitchen countertops, a deck off the back. She suggested I draw from my savings to fund the improvements since it's your house and it'll increase your equity. Over the course of 3 months, I had withdrawn $40,000 for renovations. The countertops had been installed. The deck had not been started. When I asked about the deck funds, Veronica showed me a quote and said the contractor had delayed. That was 6 months ago. Barbara was quiet for a moment when I told her that part. "Do you have documentation of those withdrawals and what they were intended for?" she asked. "I have the bank records," I said, and a few text messages where Veronica outlined what the money was for. "Keep everything," Barbara said. "All of it." I drove home that afternoon and I walked through the house room by room. Not dramatically, I just walked through it. I looked at Diane's rose beds through the back window. I stood in the kitchen where we had made Christmas cookies every year until the kids grew up and then made them anyway because Diane said, "Traditions don't retire just because the children do." I stood in the hallway outside what used to be our master bedroom and I thought about everything I had let happen in that house over the past 8 months. And then I went to the den and measured the space. I took photographs of the unfinished floor, the exposed joists, the window that sat 18 inches from the ceiling. I sent them to Barbara with the message, "This is what they wanted to put me in." She replied, "I'll have the notice ready Friday." I didn't serve it immediately. I waited 3 weeks, and here is why. I needed to know how far things would actually go. I needed to know if Connor would come to me on his own. What happened instead was the conversation I had not expected. It was a Thursday evening. Connor came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. Veronica was out. She had a standing Thursday night thing with her sister. Connor sat down at the kitchen table, which he almost never did anymore, and he said, "Dad, we need to talk about the bedroom situation." I poured my coffee and sat across from him. "Veronica really has her heart set on the nursery," he said. I know it's not ideal, but she's been talking to her therapist about starting a family, and having the space ready is important to her emotionally. She's not pregnant, I said. Not yet, but we're planning to start trying. Connor, I said, do you understand what they're asking me to do? Do you understand what the den is? He shifted in his chair. We talked about finishing it out. Proper flooring, drywall. It could actually be a nice space. It has a window the size of a shoebox. We'd add egress, stop. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was just done. I need you to listen to me. Not to Veronica's plan, not to whatever your therapist or hers or anyone else is saying. I need you to look at me and tell me if you understand what you're asking. He looked at me. For the first time in months, he actually looked at me. And I watched something move across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like recognition. The kind that comes when someone has been inside a situation so long, they forgot what it looks like from the outside. I don't want you to be uncomfortable, he said, and his voice was different. I have been uncomfortable for 8 months, I said quietly. I have watched my garage get reorganized, my equipment moved, my name removed from conversations about my own house. I gave $40,000 for renovations, and I'm still waiting on a deck. And now I'm being asked to move into an unfinished basement so your wife can have a nursery for a baby that doesn't exist yet. The room was very quiet. The deck money, he said slowly. 6 months ago, I said. I have the text. He put his hands flat on the table. He stared at them. I haven't been paying attention, he said finally. No, I agreed. You haven't. I didn't play him the text that night. I didn't call Barbara or make any announcements. I just told him I needed him to think seriously about how things had gotten to this point and that we would talk again in a few days. 3 days later, Veronica left for the weekend to visit a college friend in Pittsburgh. I knew she was going because she told me Friday morning, breezy and light, like we were any ordinary household, and she was just keeping me in the loop. That Saturday evening, Connor knocked on my door. He asked if he could come in. He sat in the chair by the window, the same chair Diane used to sit in when she'd come tell me about her day, and he said, I found the texts, Dad. I went through her phone. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to see. He had seen not just the text about the deck. He had seen a conversation between Veronica and her sister from the previous November in which Veronica outlined, in fairly specific terms, a plan to ease me out of the house gradually, frame the basement as a temporary arrangement, and eventually encourage me to consider independent living options so they could have the house to themselves. She called it the long game, Connor said. He looked like he hadn't slept. I didn't say anything for a while. I don't know who my wife is, he said. I think you do, I said. You've known for a while. You just didn't want to. We talked for 4 hours that night. Not about the legal situation, not about what I was going to do, just about everything that had happened since Diane died, about how Connor had been searching for stability, how Veronica had provided what felt like certainty in a period of chaos, how he had stopped trusting his own instincts because she had a way of making him doubt them. He cried once, briefly. I didn't try to manage it. Sometimes grief and clarity arrive at the same time. I told him I had already spoken to an attorney. He nodded like he wasn't surprised. What are you going to do? He asked. Protect myself, I said, the way I should have done 8 months ago. On Monday, I served the formal notice, 60 days, as Barbara had recommended. Both Connor and Veronica were named because legally that was necessary. When Veronica read it, she came to find me in the backyard where I was watering Diane's roses. Her tone was different then, cooler. She asked if I was serious. I built that deck with my hands and my money, I said, without looking up from the roses. Yes, I'm serious. She went back inside. The 60 days were not comfortable. Veronica was brittle and cold. Connor was somewhere between two lives, trying to figure out which one was real. I kept to my routine. Coffee at 6:15, crossword in the morning, work on a consulting project I'd taken on part-time to keep my mind active. I was polite at dinner when we shared meals, which was less often now. I was not cruel. But I was also done being managed. At week 3, Veronica came to me with a settlement proposal, which her own attorney had apparently drafted. She offered to repay $20,000 of the $40,500 in exchange for my withdrawing the notice and agreeing to restructure the living arrangements. I read it, thanked her, and handed it to Barbara. Barbara sent a counter-proposal, full repayment of the $40,000, plus written acknowledgement of the arrangement, or we proceed with the notice and she simultaneously pursues civil recovery of the funds. Veronica agreed to the full repayment within 10 days. On day 58 of the 60, Connor carried the last of their things to the moving truck. He had found a rental in Westerville, a decent two-bedroom, and he was going alone. He and Veronica were separating, not formally divorced yet, but apart. He had made that decision himself over several weeks in conversations I was not part of and did not try to influence. He stood at the front door with one last box in his arms, and he looked at me for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I know," I said. "I should have. Connor." I stepped forward and took the box from him, set it down, and put my hand on his shoulder. "You're my son. That doesn't have a 60-day notice attached to it. You understand me?" He nodded. His jaw was tight. "Call me when you're settled," I said. "Come for dinner. The door is always open." He picked the box back up and walked to the truck. I stood on the front porch and watched them drive away. The street was quiet. The rose beds needed deadheading. I'd been putting it off. The deck was still not built, but with $40,000 returned to my account, I could hire someone good to do it properly in the spring. I went inside and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table alone, and for the first time in 8 months, the silence in that house felt like mine again. Not loneliness. I know what loneliness feels like, and this wasn't it. This was space, room to breathe, the particular quiet of a house that is exactly as large as it needs to be. I called Barbara the next morning to close out the legal side of things. She asked how I was doing. "Better," I said, and I meant it completely. I am not telling this story because I want sympathy. I'm telling it because I spent 8 months convincing myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as being a good father. It isn't. Keeping the peace at the cost of your own dignity isn't generosity, it's erasure. And at 67 years old, after building bridges for 34 years and raising a son I am proud of despite everything, I am not available to be erased. Diane would have told me all of this in month 1. She always had a cleaner view of these things than I did, but I think she also knows, wherever she is, that I got there eventually. The roses are doing well, by the way. A little late in the season, but still blooming. That's enough for me. I've thought a lot about the 8 months that led to that Thursday evening in the kitchen. Not obsessively. I am too old for obsession and too tired for regret, but honestly, the way you think about a bridge you built and then go back years later to look at the load it's carrying, what I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened in that house was sudden. Every piece of it arrived slowly, quietly, dressed up as something reasonable. The garage reorganization, the missed rent payments, the $40,000 that built half a kitchen and zero of a deck. None of it announced itself as what it actually was. That is how these things work. They don't knock on the door. They come in while you're holding it open for someone you love. I let it happen because I confused kindness with passivity. I told myself that swallowing my discomfort was a form of love. But what I was actually doing was teaching the people in that house that my boundaries did not exist. And once you teach that lesson, it is very hard to unlearn. Veronica didn't invent the situation she found. I handed it to her, one quiet accommodation at a time. Connor is not a villain in this story. I want to be clear about that. He is a man who loved someone and let that love narrow his field of vision until he couldn't see what was right in front of him. I have done that myself, in smaller ways, at different points in my life. The difference is that someone eventually held up a mirror. For Connor, that mirror was a phone he probably shouldn't have looked at. But sometimes the truth arrives in imperfect packaging, and you take it anyway. What I learned at 67 is that self-respect is not selfishness. Protecting what you have built, your home, your finances, your dignity, is not cruelty to the people you love. It is, in fact, the most honest thing you can offer them. When I called Barbara and said I need to know my options, I wasn't choosing myself over my son. I was refusing to disappear. And a father who disappears teaches his children nothing worth knowing. There is a version of this story where I moved to the basement, where I told myself it was temporary, that the relationship was worth the sacrifice, that I was being the bigger person. I know how that story ends. It ends with a man who spent his final years apologizing for taking up space in his own life. I chose a different ending, not because I am particularly brave, and not because I had it all figured out. I chose it because at some point, the cost of staying silent became higher than the cost of speaking. And when I finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Things moved. Actions have weight. The choices Connor made had consequences. The choices Veronica made had consequences. And the choice I made, 8 months too late but not too late, had consequences too. That is not punishment. That is just how life works when you stop pretending otherwise. The roses are still blooming. The coffee is still at 6:15. The house is quiet in a way that feels like mine. That is enough.